and Betty and the Nancys and Bills and Joes and Janes will find in the study of science a richer, more rewarding life.
Hey, welcome to Inquiring Minds. I'm Indre. This is a podcast that explores the space where science and society collide. We want to find out what's true, what's left to discover, and why it matters. I've been making this podcast for over a decade now, so it's almost inevitable that I have repeat guests. But there are some people who have a permanent, anytime you like, open invitation to come on the show. And this week's guest is one of those. Physicist Sean Carroll has mastered the art of taking something we encounter every day and not only revealing its magic, but giving us the foundational knowledge that we need to have really interesting conversations with the experts who study it. We've had him on the show in the past to talk about his book, The Big Picture, on the origins of life, meaning, and the universe itself. So you get what I'm talking about. And more recently, Space, Time, and Motion, which was the first in his 3-part series on the biggest ideas in the universe. Now, if you haven't heard those episodes, I highly recommend that you give them a listen and listen to anything else that Sean Carroll is in. But if you have, then you know you're in for a treat. And so today we get to hear Sean talk about the second installment in his Biggest Ideas in the Universe series, this time on Quanta and Fields. So if you still don't know who he is, Sean Carroll is the Homewood Professor of Natural Philosophy at Johns Hopkins, which is a joint appointment in physics and philosophy, which seems to me like the perfect home for someone who has had a storied career in theoretical physics and also has turned his attention to some of the foundational questions about the universe and has built an extensive career bringing science to the general public through his appearances on TV and radio, his books, and his own weekly podcast, Mindscape. Sean Carroll, welcome back to the show.
Indre, thanks so much. I'm humbled by this idea that you've been doing this for a decade now. Oh my goodness, I'm in awe.
Yeah, it does make one feel a little old. But then I started thinking, well, maybe no. I was like, we were pioneers. This is when podcasting, like you had to explain to people what a podcast was.
You absolutely, yeah. No, I mean, I think mine is about 5 years old, so you've lapped me there. Yeah.
Well, you seem to be incredibly consistent with Mindscape, and the conversations are always interesting. But it's such a delight to be able to turn the microphone onto you and talk about this latest book. So let's just give the listeners a bit of a background of how this project came out of the pandemic and sort of what your initial goals with it were.
Yeah, it came about. We had a pandemic, you may have heard, right? And we kind of locked down and tried to stay home. And some people were thinking about, okay, what can I do to make it a little bit more tolerable for everyone who's going to be locked at home? And we really didn't know a lot of things, right, about how we were going to interact and work and so forth. And my friend Lauren Gunderson, who is a playwright, mentioned on Facebook that she was going to start doing playwriting seminars, which I thought was a wonderful idea. So I thought that's something that I could do, but not for playwriting, but I could do it for physics. I had no idea how to do it. I went to a local camera store. This is when we were still in LA. Plenty of video equipment ready to be purchased and, got a green screen and everything. And I started doing these videos called The Biggest Ideas in the Universe. And the idea was, the original idea was that I would talk about a concept like time or mass or whatever for 15, 20 minutes, just explain that idea. And of course, it grew into an hour and a half because I like to explain things. And the gimmick turned out to be that I would actually write down the equations. I would have my iPad and I would be drawing little stick figures, but I would also show people the equations and try to explain what all the symbols meant. Not at the level where you could solve them like you were a graduate student or anything like that, but the level you could actually know what was going on in those equations. And so 48 videos later, I thought it would be fun to turn it into a book series, and that's where we are.
Yeah, and I think originally you thought this would be, one big, thick book?
Yeah, so my personal desires clashed with those of the publishing industry. There were other examples like Roger Penrose's book, The Road to Reality. I mean, there's basically two other examples of books that are similar to what I'm trying to do. One is this giant book, 1,000-page book by Roger Penrose called The Road to Reality. And the other is a series of books by Leonard Susskind and collaborators called the Theoretical Minimum books. But they're both different also than what I want to do. But I like Penrose's thing, just like, here it is, everything you need to know in one place. And the publisher came back to me saying, we have zero interest in that because we think that people want to buy short books now, not long books. So they said, can you break it up into a 7-part series? And I said, no, I cannot do that. So we compromised on 3. And actually, the 3 make sense. They fit together quite nicely.
Yeah, so the first one was Space, Time, and Motion. And then this is the second, Quanta and Fields. And in the forward to the book, or maybe in the first chapter, you talk about how in space, time, and motion, you could give us those equations almost like untouched, like exactly as you would if you were a
Yeah.
physicist. But in this book, you had to make a few compromises. So tell us why and what are those compromises that you made?
Yeah. So just for so people have it in their minds, like the 3-part series is basically classical physics, space, time, and motion, quantum physics and quantum field theory. That's the current one. And then the next one will be complexity and emergence. And it's kind of like appetizer, main course, dessert. Like this is the main course that we're talking about right now. This is what most modern physicists think about: quantum mechanics, quantum field theory, particle physics, etc. And there's honestly just too much of it. If I wanted to write a book that was similar in length to book 1, which was the idea, and I wanted to really, I wanted to bring people up to the cutting edge of modern physics. We don't speculate in these books. It's not about string theory or the multiverse or whatever. It's about well-established physics, but there's a lot of well-established physics. And if you read these books, you will have heard in detail about topics that many people who get a PhD in physics don't get to hear about. So that required that I not simplify and not sort of dumb it down, but make the notation in the equations a little bit more centered on the important ideas and less centered on the specific fiddly details that your professional physicist would worry about.
And I think that's really, a selling point for a lot of people who are not professional physicists who really want to get a deep understanding of what's going on, but, don't want to spend 7 years in graduate school figuring out all the details. But you also mentioned that sometimes some of the topics that you're covering are still, there's still big arguments amongst physicists and that you have to pick a side at some point. So tell us how you made some of those decisions and maybe give us an example of a whether it's like a framework or, I think the one that I was thinking now was close to when you started talking about many worlds and
Yeah.
but yeah, sort of. So how do we both, if we don't know you, trust that what you're saying is not going to be too far in one direction or another, that it does kind of give us an overview of what most physicists would agree with, but also gets interesting enough as opposed to just kind of hand waving and say, well, we don't know the
Right.
details yet, so let's not talk about it.
Yeah, no, this is an excellent set of questions here because quantum mechanics, you may have heard, is a source of controversy even among physicists. We use it to exquisite precision. All the predictions that are coming true with the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, et cetera, are based fundamentally on quantum mechanics and quantum field theory. But we don't claim within the physics community to agree on what the theory actually says. There are circumstances in which we know what it predicts, but we don't exactly agree on the details of how you get there. And this is the subject of the foundations of quantum mechanics. And I wrote a whole book about that subject with very few equations in it. And that was not the point of this new book, to rehearse those debates. I wanted to act like the working physicist. I wanted to get those predictions out. But what that means is that it's hard to talk about things like what really exists in the world. This is exactly what physicists don't agree on, what really exists in the world. And most books that talk about this kind of stuff, virtual particles, renormalization, these kinds of things, they will implicitly assume some answer to the question, what is the foundations of quantum mechanics, what really exists, etc. They're just inconsistent with other people writing books at the same level. So I wanted to be a bit more honest. And my own favorite formulation of quantum mechanics is, like you say, the many worlds interpretation, but I don't assume that that's true for the book. I mention it and I mention alternatives, and then I move on, but there was a choice that said, like, wait, once you get to field theory, and so what is really going on, I could, for every statement I make the same statement 4 different times, right? In this
Mhm.
interpretation, you would say this, and this interpretation, you would say that. That would be incredibly tedious and not very illuminating. So I said, I'm not assuming that many worlds is right, but I'm going to talk as if what we call the wave function, the quantum mechanical state of the system, is exactly the physical reality under consideration. That's the language that I'm going to use. And if anyone
Mhm.
out there is a partisan of some other approach, they are welcome to translate what I'm saying into that approach. It's not actually trying to take a stance, it's just trying to get to the good stuff. That was my goal.
Yeah, so let's get to some of the good stuff and talk about, I mean, I think maybe one place to start, at least it was for me, was a kind of, oh, this is different from what I've kind of read before, was when you introduce the concept of fields versus particles. So let's start there. Let's
Yeah.
say people have read, your first book and they get it, or they have a solid knowledge of kind of the whole particle idea that
hmm
that's what matter is made up of. Where do fields come in?
Well, this is a fascinating historical story as well as a scientific one. In the 1800s, famously, by the end of the 1800s, some people thought physics was almost done, right? Actually, not as many as they say. There was a lot of people who knew that we were not done yet, but you could understand why they might think that, because we had a picture that was sort of coming into focus where matter was made of particles. We had discovered electrons and we knew about the nuclei of atoms and things like that, or at least some atoms. The whole picture came a little bit later. Um, and that's, goes back to Isaac Newton, the idea of a particle. It has a location in space, it has some mass, it's some charge or whatever. And then we also knew about fields. And this is what really came important in the 1800s, because James Clerk Maxwell unified electricity and magnetism into electromagnetism. And the way that he did that was based on this idea of, at every point in space, there is an electric field and there's also a magnetic field. And it was really Henry Faraday who actually figured. I'm getting Faraday's first name wrong. I don't know what, because there was a
Isn't it
Daniel
Michael?
Faraday on
No,
Lost. So
I'm thinking
anyway,
Michael, but maybe that's
Michael
wrong.
Faraday, yes, exactly.
Okay.
So Faraday was this fascinating character who didn't know a lot of math, but he was a genius, intuitive physicist, and he did experiments that demonstrated the need for fields. So by the end of the 1800s, you could imagine a picture where matter is made of particles, but the forces that push matter around are fields: the gravitational field, the electric field, the magnetic field, and so forth. And what happens when we invent quantum mechanics in the early years of the 20th century is, first they apply it to particles because they're trying to figure out how electrons move in atoms, but they knew that the fields were hanging around. They knew there was electromagnetism. That was everyone's favorite theory at the time. So, of course, you would try to apply it to electromagnetism and quantize that field. And they didn't, it was a struggle to get it right. And eventually, long story short, they realized that the way to think about it is that everything is a field, that both the particles that we thought we knew of, like electrons, protons, neutrons, etc., and the forces that push them around, like electromagnetism, the weak and strong nuclear forces, they could all be thought of as fields, just different kinds of fields with different properties. And that's a long story I go to in the book, but the linchpin thought is, in exactly the same way that when you put an electron in an atom, you get quantized energy levels, right? There's the lowest energy state, the next highest energy level state, the next highest energy state. This is what you study in your chemistry class. This is why you see spectral lines when gases emit radiation and so forth, because there's discrete levels of energies that electrons can have. Same thing happens for these fields that pervade the universe. They vibrate, But according to the rules of quantum mechanics, they vibrate in certain discrete amounts. And you and I, interpret those discrete amounts as there's no particles in space, there's one particle in space, there are two particles in space, etc. So it's this kind of miraculous mathematical thing where you start with no particles at all. Everything is just a field. There's nothing that has a location. Everything is just vibrating at some value at every single point in space. You apply the rules of quantum mechanics to it, and the rules of quantum mechanics tell you that what you see when you look at something like that is a set of particles interacting with each other.
And then, I mean, in this, the next phase after sort of then starting to think about those particles and thinking about atoms as in this field way of thinking, kind of now in my head, I have a very visual kind of inner mental model, and so I see these like flat fields essentially, or they're not flat, sometimes they're curved, but
that's good.
But then, traditionally, when I was taught chemistry, we heard about all that empty space, that we're basically empty space. And, one of the parts of your book that I really enjoyed was how you demonstrate that that's an incorrect visualization. So tell us about how now this, in my head, it was like how this field visualization of it explains that actually we are not just empty space.
Well, this is exactly where I'm going to get in trouble, because I tried to, this is exactly the kind of question that's very easy to ask. Why is it that people say atoms are mostly empty space? And the answer is it makes no sense to say that atoms are mostly empty space, but it depends on your favorite foundations of quantum mechanics theory. So to someone like me, where the wave function of the particle is what really exists, that wave function fills up the space in the atom. When you took your chemistry class and you saw those pictures of orbitals, right? There's like a spherical one, there's like a little elliptical kind of thing. Yeah, right. Those are the different shapes that the wave function of the electron can take. And the reason why atoms are solid is because when you try to push two atoms together, the wave functions push up against each other. The wave functions have a real physical, tangible causal effect on the world. And there's a lot of people, even professional physicists, who sort of don't want to admit that. They like to think of the electron as a little dot, moving like around the solar system. And it's just, according to the rules of quantum mechanics, it's just not like that. And as soon as you move from this picture of an electron as a point-like particle to the electron as a quantized wave function, then the fact that atoms take up space makes perfect sense, and you can go on with your life.
I mean, I think that to me was before I read your book, this core problem between understanding sort of the classical physics standard model and quantum mechanics, and not being able to put the two together. But in my head, and maybe this is just an oversimplification, thinking about it as fields starts to allow me to put those two major frameworks into something that seems coherent.
Yeah, look, it's tricky, and I feel bad for the people who are struggling with this, because there's actually two levels of fieldiness in quantum field theory. If the world were not made of fields, if it were made of particles, but it was governed by the rules of quantum mechanics, there would be something called the wave function. There would still be wave-like properties that electrons have. If you know about the double slit experiment, or like we were just talking about, the electrons in the orbitals in atoms, that would all be true. That waviness would still be there if the theory of the world that was the best one we had was a quantum theory of particles. The problem with that theory is that in the usual quantum theory of particles, the particles can't be created or destroyed. They're there. If you start with 5 particles, you shake the box or whatever, you end up with 5 particles. And we know that that's not true in the real world. We have radioactivity, right? Particles decay into other particles. We know that photons are produced. When you jiggle an electron, you produce photons, and you see them as light. The number of particles in the world is not a constant. It changes. And ultimately, the right way to do that is to start with a field and then quantize it. And quantizing is a terrible name, because really we want to make a wave function of the field. fields. And it gets very, very confusing. And I'm trying to say it in sort of the most confusing way possible, just to rub home that it all makes sense at the end of the day, but you have to sort of let go of your everyday intuition a little bit. You have to be willing to really think about the world in a slightly unusual, counterintuitive way.
And I think for people who have delved a little bit more deeply into, physics, into sort of understanding entropy, understanding that, we are, and anybody who's interested in climate change, we are entering a world that's more and more chaotic and difficult to predict. There you have a whole chapter on symmetry, and I just that in some ways was just really encouraging, and it made me feel calm, like thinking about just the power of symmetry. So yeah, tell us a little bit about what role symmetry plays in this quantum mechanics world, where I think most of us think of it as one of the characteristics of the quantum world is chaos.
Right. Yeah. No, but that's a misimpression actually, because the reason to go into physics is because the real world is too messy, and the world of physics and particles and fields, once you wrap your head around it, is quite beautiful and simple in many ways. And symmetry is probably the single biggest reason why that's true. And symmetry comes about because you have multiple fields, and some of the fields are very different from each other, but some of the fields are almost identical. They're almost the same thing. I mean, basically, they're two parts of a single underlying field. And when you think about the way to think about that is just a vector in three-dimensional space, right? You have a vector pointing in some direction in three-dimensional space. We typically tell you what the vector is by giving you components of the vector. That is to say, we set up an axis, x, y, z, and I tell you how much of the vector is pointing along the x-axis, the y-axis, the z-axis. But what matters is the vector, not the components, because I could just rotate my axes. I could pick different axes and get different components. It's just a way of describing what really matters. And so that implies the existence of a symmetry. Whenever there's something that you use in your theory that in some sense doesn't matter, that means there's a symmetry. You have three axes, but I can rotate them. There's a symmetry. It doesn't matter what you call X, Y, or Z, or some combination thereof. It's all the same. Many, many choices give you the same answer. That's what a symmetry is to a physicist. And this happens over and over again. And it turns out that the existence of these symmetries explains the existence of the forces of nature. Why do we have electromagnetism? Why do we have gravity? Why do we have the weak and strong nuclear forces? Ultimately, because there are symmetries, and those symmetries imply the existence of fields, and those fields imply the existence of forces.
I love that. It's so beautiful. And it
It
feels
is.
like
It's actually like once you that's the motivation for doing the work to understand these equations, because I can say the words all you want, but seeing it gives you a level of appreciation that you couldn't otherwise get.
In your book, Big Picture, you talk about consciousness. And last time when I had you on the show to talk about that, I was impressed at how you didn't, and this is going to sound totally ridiculous, that you didn't fall into the trap that I see a lot of physicists fall into, which is explain something they don't understand with something else they don't understand. Which
Oh
is
yeah,
like,
I
sorry,
know it.
that sounds
I
really
know it well.
condescending. But then so your consciousness explanation is really great, and I still think it holds up very well. And in this book, in chapter 11, you connect quantum mechanics to what we observe in everyday life. And so I wonder if you could speak to how we should do that, and how we can kind of take the mystification of quantum mechanics, and the kind of the urge to just say, oh well, it's quantum, and therefore must be, the conscious must exist
Right.
outside the body, or that kind of explanation.
Yeah, I think that this is an example in the book where I do realize that some of these ideas are tough, right? Some of them are very esoteric and mathy. So I try to give the reader a reward. So, like, after you've done some hard chapters, I want to give you like a fun chapter. And once you've learned enough about wave functions and dimensional analysis and things like that, you know enough now to understand why atoms have the sizes that they
Hmm.
do, and
Hmm.
why when you put multiple atoms together you get molecules, and why they have the sizes that they do. And it's all ultimately because of properties of electromagnetism and the fine structure constant and things like that. But what matters is at the end of the day, you build up this hierarchy, right? I mean, the world is not all, we don't live in a world made of billiard balls bouncing into each other, because all billiard balls are basically the same size. They're just doing the same thing. The fact that an electron is much lighter than a proton and a neutron, and the fact that electromagnetism is a somewhat weak but not super weak force, combine to give this incredible richness of chemistry, which is what allows the incredible richness of biology, which is what allows the incredible richness of our brains and our consciousness. And none of that is to say that I know what consciousness is. I just know that it doesn't need to require you change the laws of physics to understand it. The laws of physics are fine.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons I'm really excited about complexity and emergence, because I think that's just going to be a really fascinating book as well. But now I want to talk about education in this new post-pandemic era.
Mm.
I think this was a pandemic project for you, and it might have changed. I imagine the kind of focus of where your work was headed as you embarked onto this project. And for me, of course, there was the move to online teaching that was a big revelatory moment, and more participation and thinking about how students learn in these kinds of different environments. But then, November 22, I guess, or I can't remember now, when we all got to play with Chat GPT, and now
Yep.
we saw the power of Gen AI in these large language models. We're now into another revolution of learning, and I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on, you created these lectures. They're available. Anybody can go. I think it's preposterousuniverse.com or something like
That's
that,
right.
right?
Exactly right. Yep.
Okay. And they can watch you do these lectures, but then you also wrote these books. And so these are two different formats of some of the same material. And so, how do you think about the role that books play versus watching lectures online versus engaging in person with a professor? Like, how do you think about learning now in this new world of ours?
Yeah, I think I've always been a pluralist about these things. I don't think there's the one right way to do things. I
Mhm.
remember very vividly when my first book came out, my first trade book, From Eternity to Here, about the arrow of time. After that, I was invited to do a set of lectures for the teaching company
Mhm.
about the arrow of time, more or less based on the book, similar kind of thing. And so I excitedly told my editor at the book publisher, "Oh, I'm doing this teaching company course. That means we'll sell more books." And he was like, "Oh, you sweet summer child, you're not going to sell any more books by doing this, because the people who listen to the teaching company lectures or watch the videos, love it and get into it, but they're different people than the people who buy the books."
Mhm.
And he was completely correct. I was, completely wrong. When I told my editor I wanted to write books on the basis of these YouTube videos, by now everyone understands it. So like, there was no thought that I was hurting my book sales by having the YouTube videos up there. It's quite the opposite. And I
Mhm.
think that there are some people who naturally like to watch videos and like to watch the facial expressions of the person talking, etc. There's some people who like to watch but don't want to see the person's facial expressions, just want to see the demonstration or whatever. Some people want to read. Some people want to read very short things, tweets or articles. Some people want to read long, ponderous things. Some people want audio. Some people want in person. I think that's good. I think that we now have, I think the good thing about technology is it doesn't change the way that we singularly educate people. It offers more variety in how we
Mhm.
can get educated. I'm especially excited about the fact that it 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 hasn't happened yet, but I do believe that if we let people know about it, we can really encourage lifelong learning in a way that was always harder before.
Mhm.
More people should have hobbies of taking online courses and learning things. It's not a substitute for
Mhm.
going to class and talking to the professor, and even better, interacting with your fellow students. There will always be an important role for in-person interactions, I think. But the fact that we do have this variety and these other opportunities, I don't think we've taken full advantage of them yet.
And yeah, the more tasks that we can outsource to Gen AI that aren't very meaningful to us, the more time we have to engage in some of these hobbies. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on sort of this generation of people who are growing up with these tools already available to them, the temptation to be in a classroom and use these tools and not struggle with the
Yeah,
essays. And the reason that I'm asking this of you is because you know you are asking us to struggle a little bit in reading these books, right? These are not like armchair, I'm going to sit and have my glass of wine and not have to think very hard and going to be told a story. Like these are, to really get the most out of these books, you kind of have to struggle with them a little bit. And I think that's rewarding, that you feel like you're actually doing something, and you feel like your brain growing. I mean, it doesn't really, but that's what it feels like, right? Um so how do you think about, like, either the future generation of university students or the general public, and this kind of, as things become easier and easier and we don't even have to struggle with things like writing an email when there's, these all these suggested, phrases that are being
yeah,
sent to us. Yeah,
yep.
like
I think, let's say that people will have to work to read the books, not struggle to read the books.
all right.
Just, as a slight, friendly amendment there. Um, I, on the one hand, think that AI is going to be a wonderful tool. It's really, I use it, ChatGPT or Claude, which is the Anthropic product or
Mm,
whatever,
mhm,
but it's not quite, at least right now, the tool that people think it is.
mhm,
Because certainly I've noticed almost every time that I ask it a hard physics question, and by hard, I don't mean like it's difficult to go through the reasoning, just like an advanced level physics question. It's wrong more often in the answer than it's right, right? I
mm,
mean, it just makes a
mm.
lot of
Yeah.
very simple mistakes because they're trained to complete sentences, and there's not a lot of sentences out there about super advanced physics topics. There's a small number, and so they kind of get mixed up. And anyone who does this a lot knows that you can sort of coax it to give the right answer by repeating the question and things like that. But I find it much more useful as sort of a super search engine, right? Searching
Mhm,
for ideas. Like when
mhm,
I taught a course last year, one thing that ChatGPT will do is write your course syllabus for you. And I had an idea. I knew what my course syllabus was going to be, but I asked
mhm,
GPT to do it just so that I could verify that I wasn't missing something important. The
mm,
very first thing it gave me was a hallucination. It said this should be the first thing people read, and it was an article that didn't exist. But I could read through all of its suggestions and go, oh yeah, like I hadn't thought of that one. You're right,
mhm,
ChatGPT. I should have done that, right? But I wouldn't believe it if it mentioned something that I'd never heard of before. I think this is slightly unfair, but I heard a very pithy condensation of this on the internet. I forget who said it. I can't give them credit, but basically they said use AI to write things if and only if those things will never be read by anybody. So in other
hmm,
words, like boilerplate or
mhm,
emails that are just sort of form letters and things like that. That's fine. If you need website stuff, okay, that's fine. But for things that matter, you better do it yourself. And I was fascinated. I don't know how this generalizes. I taught two courses last fall, one in physics, one in philosophy. They were the first two courses I taught um, post the appearance of large language models on the net. And so
mhm,
I dialogued with the students. I said, look, if you want to use this tool, that's fine. Just let me know. I mean, just be honest about what you're doing. The papers we're writing, I asked them all to write papers, but these papers are too specific to just sort of outsource to a large language model. And what they uniformly said was, yeah, we're not going to use it.
hmm,
They just didn't use it at all because
hmm,
the papers we're writing, they're not like generic. They're very, very specific. They had to pick a topic that,
mhm,
was not going to be found in very similar ways. If you want to use it to spruce up your prose or whatever, that's great. But these students were smart enough that they didn't just let ChatGPT write their papers. And I think that that's wise.
Yeah, and it reminds me too of kind of how we had this generation of kids that grew up with social media at their fingertips. We saw the damage that it did to a lot of their mental health and social skills and all these other things. And now the generation that's coming up is very savvy about how they're
Exactly.
using social media. And so there's this learning that happens really pretty quickly. One of the other things that I wondered what you thought about too is this trend in a lot of university teaching to flip the classroom. So,
Right.
you have these students who go and listen to your lecture and you've posted them. I can imagine you teaching a course where you say, look, the lectures are there. When we come into the classroom, we're going to interact. But I also think that there is still something unique about being in the room with a professor who's lecturing, and that being able to like have someone there and process what they're saying at the same time as you're taking notes and have the opportunity to ask questions is incredibly valuable. But I feel like I'm becoming the minority amongst a lot of my university colleagues in
I'm with you
uplifting
in the
some of their style.
minority. I think, to me, there's sort of two paradigms that have been successful for the past 2,500 years. One is the lecture, someone who
Yeah.
knows something is talking and other people are listening. And the other is the
Mhm.
discussion or the seminar,
Mhm.
where a bunch of people are sitting around a table and having a more or less equal discussion about things. And I've done it both ways. Um, and I think that both ways are absolutely useful for different purposes, right? When I teach
Right.
100 people general relativity, it's not a seminar discussion. I'm sorry. Like, you need to
Yeah.
understand the symmetries of the Riemann tensor, and I don't want you to use the Socratic method to get there. I'm just going to tell you what they are and why they are. And then you're going to go home and do problems and you're going to work through it yourself. And that's how it will really get into your brain, right? I mean, we all
Yeah.
know the lecture by itself doesn't give you great retention or sort of great comprehension of all the nuances, but then you get the lecture to get the ideas, and then you work with the ideas, struggle with them even, right? You sit
Mhm.
and think about them yourself, and that's how it gets done. And talking to your fellow students is one way to do that. Doing a problem set is one way to do that. Writing a paper, studying for an exam, there's lots of ways to do that. But I've met extremists on the other side, who would say, I said, oh, I taught a course. It was, a graduate course in physics, and I was a lecturer to 100 people. And they said, you're not really teaching at all. That's not even teaching. Like, well, why don't you ask the students so they learned any general relativity? I think some of them came out okay.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I feel like I have students who, yeah, who are definitely craving that, and I'm definitely not one of the people who ascribes to teach to your learning style because that feels easier to you. I think it's the opposite. I think it's almost like
Yeah.
teach to the, and I guess that's why I use the word struggle in a positive way. What I mean is like I should have said is sort of wrestling with your knowledge gives you that power to be able to recall it later on. We call it, desirable difficulties in the kind of
Hmm.
learning and memory world, that you're creating these desirable difficulties because, if it's just too easy, your brain doesn't really tag it as something that's really particularly important. It doesn't lead to lasting change. Um,
Yeah,
and so
when
I
I
was
taught
really
when I
Mhm.
taught
No, go
this
ahead.
course last year on the philosophy course on naturalism, actually, we read the big picture among many other things, and it was a seminar, so like 10 people sitting around the table, and it was mostly led by the students, and I was sort of there to guide it. And the single most successful class meeting was we were talking about, is mathematics real?
Hmm.
So, real, not in the sense of being fake, but is it ontologically real? Is it like Platonism, or there's sort of more nominalism and other things? And what we realized is, like, none of us in the room, including myself, were experts on this. Some of us had opinions, some didn't, but we split the room up into half and we had a debate. Half of them defended mathematical realism, half of them defended anti-realism. And that forced them, even if they didn't, you don't necessarily have to be on the side that you actually believe. You could volunteer to be on whatever side, but it forced them to engage with both the arguments for their position and the arguments for the other position. And they loved it. It was great fun. And so I think there's lots of different ways that struggle can happen, but it's got to happen one way or the other.
So I just want to recommend your book to all of our listeners. It's called Quanta and Fields, and it's the second installment in The Biggest Ideas in the Universe, of course, by New York Times bestselling author Sean Carroll. So Sean, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast.
Indre, I'm looking forward to the next 10 years. I hope you have me on 10 years from now to celebrate.
Well, we'll definitely have you on for complexity and emergence.
Okay, good.
So don't take too long to write that one.
No, it's underway.
So that's it for another episode. Thanks for listening. And if you want to hear more, don't forget to subscribe. If you'd like to get an ad-free version of the show, consider supporting us at patreon.com/Inquiring Minds. And I'd especially like to thank our longtime supporters, David Noel, Herring Chang, Yushi Lin, Jay Henry, Joel, and Charles Blyle. Inquiring Minds is produced by Pedagogy. I'm your host, Indre Viscontis. See you next time.